Okay, so let's unpack this. We're diving deep into something pretty fascinating and, well, maybe a little controversial in the world of large language models right now. You probably heard how LLMs are getting, really good doing tasks we'd normally call reasoning.
Right. And a big part of why people feel that way is because these models often generate like intermediate steps or thoughts before they give the final answer. Think chain of thought, or what the sources we're looking at call intermediate token generation, ITG for short.
Exactly. And the common story, the one you see everywhere, is that these intermediate bits are the model's thoughts. Its reasoning process laid bare. It sounds very human, doesn't it? Like someone thinking out loud.
It really does. It's a deeply anthropomorphic is the term used. It suggests these tokens are mimicking the kind of structured, meaningful steps a person might take.
But here's the kicker, right? The core argument from the source material you brought us. It says this popular view isn't just like a slightly off metaphor. According to these experts, seeing it that way is actually, well, dangerous.
Yeah, dangerous. Because it might be wishful thinking, it doesn't seem to have solid evidence behind it. It gives us this false confidence about what the models are really up to. And crucially, it could be steering research in, frankly, the wrong direction.
Whoa, okay, dangerous. Not just inaccurate, but dangerous.
Yeah.
So our mission for this deep dive is clear. We need to pull out the key arguments from this material. We need to understand why this whole AI thoughts idea is being challenged so strongly. What's the evidence against it? And, maybe most importantly, what do these experts think is actually going on that helps these models perform so well? Let's get into it.
All right, so first things first, let's just nail down the mechanics. What is intermediate token generation? Simply put, it's just the model putting out a sequence of tokens before it gives you the final answer.
Like, if you ask it a math problem, and instead of just the number, it writes out step 1, step 2 first.
Exactly like that. And models they call large reasoning models, or LRMs, DeepSeek R1, is mentioned in the sources they're specifically designed to do this. They generate what the paper calls a derivational trace. That's the sequence of intermediate tokens, and then the final result.
And we're talking about the raw stuff here, right? The unfiltered output, not some neat summary it might cook up afterwards.
Yes, that's a critical point the sources emphasize. Some models might try to, hide the messiness later, but the argument here is really about how we interpret those raw generated token sequences themselves.
Okay, and it's true, empirically, that generating these intermediate tokens, it does usually help the model perform better on complex tasks, right?
Oh, absolutely. That part isn't really debated. The performance boost is real. The argument isn't if it helps, but why it helps, and how we should understand those intermediate bits. That performance jump is precisely why so many people leap to the aha, it's thinking conclusion.
Right, so, okay, let's get to the dangerous part. Why is calling these tokens reasoning traces or thoughts potentially harmful? What are the specific problems the source outlines?
Well, the experts argue this anthropomorphism isn't just like a philosophical mistake. It has real negative consequences for AI research and even how we might deploy these systems.
Okay, this is where it gets really juicy. What's the first danger?
First off, it leads to this misplaced focus on making the traces easy for humans to read, making them interpretable. One source points out that the developers of DeepSeek R1 actually spent effort trying to stop the model from mixing languages like English and Chinese in its trace output. They did that specifically so humans could follow along easily. But get this. Earlier versions that did mix languages sometimes perform better.
Wait, really? So they made it potentially less effective just to make it look more like human thinking? It just seems backward.
It kind of does, doesn't it? And it flows directly from wanting it to resemble human thought. Second big issue. It creates this false assumption, this belief that the correctness or, the logical quality of these intermediate tokens strongly predicts or even causes the final answer to be right. Researchers were apparently quite surprised when studies started showing that LRM answers aren't always consistent with their own intermediate traces.
Hold on. So the model can generate a trace that looks perfectly sensible step by step, but still botch the final answer. Or, conversely, produce a completely nonsensical trace, but somehow land on the right answer.
Exactly. That disconnect is a major headache for the trace equals thinking narrative. And third, the source argues it leads to these completely contradictory ways of interpreting how long the trace is. On one hand, researchers celebrate longer traces. They say, look, the model is learning to reason, more steps. But then they also celebrate when they get similar results with shorter traces, calling that learning to reason more efficiently.
So basically, whatever the model does with trace length, we just find a way to spin it as learning to reason. That does sound a bit like confirmation bias, maybe.
It certainly can look that way. And finally, this whole framing encourages some, let's say, questionable research attempts. People try to prove these tokens show the model learning specific algorithms humans designed. They might even claim the models become more optimal than the original algorithms based on things like shorter traces.
It really sounds like this thoughts idea acts like a lens, doesn't it? It makes us interpret everything the model does in that specific way, and maybe we miss what's actually driving the behavior.
That's precisely the concern raised. It could be mixing up correlation and causation and potentially wasting a lot of valuable research effort chasing this human-like analogy.
Okay, so if these intermediate tokens aren't thinking in the human sense, what are they? And what's the actual evidence in the materials suggesting they might lack semantic meaning, at least in the way we understand it?
Yeah, the sources offer some pretty compelling points against the idea that these tokens carry meaning like human thoughts do.
Give us an example. What's compelling?
Okay, remember that aha moment idea, how DeepSeek R1 sometimes outputs the token aha within its trace. Now, when a human says aha, it usually signals some kind of internal click or realization, right? But the source argues that when the model outputs aha, it's not having an epiphany. It's not an internal state change. It's simply generating that token because based on everything that came before it and its training data, aha is statistically the most likely next token to produce. That token then just becomes part of the input context for generating the next token after that.
Ah, okay. So it's just pattern completion, token prediction,
No.
not a sign of inner understanding.
That's the argument. Another big piece of evidence is just the sheer scale and complexity of these traces sometimes. One source mentions DeepSeek R1 generating 30 pages of text. 30 for a single, maybe not even that complex problem.
30 pages.
Yeah, 30 pages. Trying to actually verify if that enormous block of natural language constitutes sound, step-by-step reasoning, it's practically impossible. And maybe most tellingly, LLM evaluations almost always just check the final answer. They rarely, if ever, check if the intermediate steps themselves are logically sound or coherent.
So we call it reasoning, but we don't even really check the supposed reasoning itself. That's interesting.
It is, but maybe the most powerful evidence comes from experiments where researchers actually messed with the traces. One study used something called an A-search trace validator. That's a tool specifically designed to check the formal, step-by-step logic of a trace for that particular search algorithm. Very rigorous. What they found was only a loose correlation between how correct the model's trace was, according to this strict validator, and whether the final answer was correct.
Only loose, not strong. That seems important if the trace is the reasoning.
Not strong, no. And here's where it gets really counterintuitive, almost weird. They found that training the model on noisy intermediate traces with errors, or even traces that were completely irrelevant to the problem, surprisingly, either maintained the model's performance or sometimes even increased it compared to training on clean, perfectly correct traces.
Hold up. Training it on wrong steps or irrelevant stuff made it perform the same or better.
Yes.
That feels completely upside down if those steps are supposed to be the thinking process.
It absolutely challenges that core assumption, yeah. And other studies found similar things in, like, question answering tasks. They specifically train models using data sets where they deliberately paired an incorrect intermediate trace with a correct final answer. And the models still learned to produce the correct final answers. In one intervention, the models trained with the incorrect traces actually did better than the ones trained with correct traces.
Okay, my brain hurts a little now. That seems fundamentally weird.
It's definitely surprising stuff, and there's more. Experiments using distillation, where you use a big model to teach a smaller one, showed that the smaller LLMs were incredibly robust to noise in the traces they learned from. Like, the traces could contain obvious math errors, but the smaller model still learned the underlying task effectively. And another model they mentioned, called dual former, actually got better results by using truncated traces, basically cutting the trace off partway through. That explicitly destroys any idea of a complete, semantically coherent argument within the trace.
Okay, wow. There's quite a pile of evidence suggesting these intermediate tokens don't actually need to be meaningful or logically sound, at least not to a human, for the model to get the right answer in the end. Which brings us right back to the big question. If it's not thinking, then why on earth does generating these tokens help? What are they doing?
That is absolutely the million-dollar question, isn't it? And this is where the sources pivot. They start offering alternative ways to think about it, ways that step away from the human analogy.
All right, let's hear them. What are these alternative explanations?
Okay, one major idea presented is that we should view the improvement in these large reasoning models as the model learning incrementally from a verifier signal. Think about the kinds of tasks where these models excel: math, writing code, formal planning problems. Many of these domains have external formal ways to check if a solution is correct.
You mean like a compiler for code that tells you if it runs? Or software that can verify a mathematical proof?
Exactly, those kinds of things. The source suggests the performance boost isn't coming from the model learning human-like reasoning steps. Instead, it's coming from the model learning how to leverage these external verifiers, maybe during training, maybe during fine-tuning, maybe even at test time, through feedback loops. The model gets better at generating sequences of tokens that are statistically likely to result in a final output that passes the verifier's check.
Ah, I see. So it's not internalizing the process we use, but internalizing the criteria for correctness defined by that external tool.
You could sort of think of it like the model is slowly compiling or internalizing the feedback signal from that verifier into its own generation process. The source materials discuss visuals showing this kind of feedback loop, where the verifier signal helps refine the model's outputs over time. And this perspective helps explain how models get better at harder problems too. They just get better at generating outputs that satisfy more complex verification checks.
Okay. That makes a certain kind of sense. It shifts the focus from the trace looking right to the final answer being verifiable. What's the second alternative idea?
The second idea is maybe even more radical. It says, let's just embrace the idea that these intermediate tokens might be reasonless, at least in a semantic sense. Let's view them simply as prompt augmentations.
Prompt augmentations. So if they don't necessarily have meaning like our thoughts, maybe they're just, I don't know, extra text that somehow helps the model process the original request better.
Precisely. It builds on something we already know works really well with LLMs. Giving the model some extra text before the main query often boosts its performance on that query.
Yeah, we do that all the time with prompting, right? We give context, examples, step-by-step instructions.
Exactly. So the idea here is to frame those internally generated intermediate tokens as just that: prompt augmentations generated by the model itself. The absolutely key insight, though, is that the goal of this augmentation isn't for it to be meaningful or understandable to a human reading it. The goal is just for it to be the statistically right sequence of tokens that, when fed back into the model along with the original prompt, increases the probability of the model generating a correct final answer on its next try.
Okay, so chain of thought prompting, where we literally ask the model to think step by step, might just be a human-friendly trick. A way to coax the model into producing some sequence of tokens that happens to function as a useful prompt augmentation, even if the steps themselves aren't real reasoning.
That's basically the argument. And if that's true, the real challenge isn't making the traces look human, but figuring out what the optimal prompt augmentation actually is for any given problem and any specific model. And crucially, that optimal sequence might look like, well, nothing like human reasoning at all. It could be complete gibberish to us.
Which, wow, that opens up completely different research paths, doesn't it?
Totally. The source talks about potential future work using, say, a separate actor, LLM. Its only job would be to learn, maybe through reinforcement learning, how to generate these optimal prompt augmentations. These augmentations might be totally non-semantic, maybe not even readable language. The only goal would be maximizing the final answer accuracy of the main LLM. Who cares what the augmentation looks like?
Fascinating. It really does flip the perspective, doesn't it? It takes us away from, is the AI thinking like me, to the AI is doing something else and that something else works really well.
It's a very different way of framing the internal process.
So let's try and bring this all together for you, the listener. What are the absolute must-know takeaways from digging into this source material?
Well, I think the main takeaway is the really strong argument presented in these sources against seeing LLM intermediate tokens as human-like thinking or reasoning. The evidence from these different experiments really does seem to suggest that these tokens might lack the kind of semantic meaning we instinctively assign to them.
Right, and the performance improvements we definitely see are likely coming from other places, less human-like mechanisms.
Exactly. The paper suggests these improvements are better explained either by models learning to internalize signals from external verifiers, basically, learning how to generate answers that can be proven correct, or by these intermediate tokens acting as really effective, statistically learned prompt augmentations. Augmentations that might not make any sense to us, but just happen to guide the model towards the right final output.
And the danger isn't just getting it wrong academically. Thinking these models think like us can lead to, false confidence about how well we understand them. And it could actually misdirect research effort toward making AI look like it's thinking, rather than figuring out and optimizing how it really works, whatever that might be.
Yeah, it's a strong call to kind of shift our perspective, move away from the easy anthropomorphism, and focus on the underlying mechanics, even if they're less intuitive.
This really makes you stop and think, though, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, if LLMs are getting so incredibly good at these complex tasks, things we've always linked with human reason, solving tough problems, writing functional code, planning sequences, but they're potentially not doing it by thinking like us or following steps that are meaningful in the way our thoughts feel meaningful. What does that tell us about the nature of problem solving itself?
It definitely raises that question. Is our conscious step-by-step semantic reasoning the only way to crack these problems, or even the best way? Always.
And it makes you wonder, maybe the future of really advanced AI involves capabilities that seem incredibly intelligent from the outside, achieving amazing things, but are powered by internal processes that are just fundamentally alien to how our human minds work. Definitely something to keep mulling over.